Aloha mai kako. You are watching Hawaii Political Reporter.
Welcome. This is James Corbett of CorbettReport.com.
And I'm James Evan Pilato of MediaMonarchy.com, and this is Good News Next Week. Of course, this is the New World Next Week, and of course you can find everything you need at NewWorldNextWeek.com, making good on our promise last week, James. After the dismal raft of stories we covered, we wanted to do an all good news episode, and so we're doing it, and we're bringing it to you here. And a huge thanks to all the people who submitted good news story ideas, just as you can submit news stories at any time using hashtag New World Next Week. So, James, we'll begin with a positive news story tweeted out by Jeffrey Jackson. That's at Jeffrey Jackson on Twitter, and I will actually be interviewing him here in just a few short hours. Monsanto's healthy environment ads banned in South Africa. The Advertising Standards Authority, ASA, of South Africa ordered biotech titan Monsanto to withdraw its ads on local radio in which the company boasts the supposed benefits of GM crops, including a healthier environment and more food sustainably. According to the ASA, the claims they made are unsubstantiated. Simple as that. Unsubstantiated. False advertising for Monsanto. If only, hopefully, we could see that here in the States. Another positive note in South Africa, bad credit history and negative information have been removed from people's credit history under a new sort of amnesty bill. So those are two good notes coming out of South Africa. James?
And let's turn over to my side of the world here in the Asia Pacific. We'll look at a story that comes from your Twitter. China destroys illegal GMO crop trials on Hainan Island. The Hainan Provincial Agricultural Department examined 107 crop samples from which it identified and destroyed 9 corn and cotton genetically modified crop trials. The department stressed that any genetically modified crop trials without prior permission are banned, and those who conduct such trials will be punished in accordance with the relevant law. China is currently getting tougher on GM crops, with public opinion in the country being firmly against the biotech industry. So some interesting developments there, and just one of a series of stories we have surrounding that biotech industry. So the next one is
via our good friend Jack Blood on Twitter at Deadline Live. Brazil looks to ban Monsanto's Roundup and other toxicity risks. Brazil's public prosecutor wants to suspend the use of glyphosate, the active ingredient in Monsanto's pervasive herbicide Roundup. The Prosecutor General's office is also pursuing bans on the herbicide 2,4-D and 7 other active herbicide ingredients in addition to glyphosate. All of that and much more you can actually get from gmwatch.org. James, before I throw it right back to you, this is a whole run of, I think, sort of food world order topics, and I find it interesting that those made up a lot of, I think, the submissions we got as good news on Good News Next Week.
Exactly right, and I think there might be a reason for that. Maybe we can discuss that later. But let's switch to the next GMO story, and kind of just summing up what we've already talked about, coming from foodworldorder.blogspot.com. GMO cultivation declines in developed nations for first time in 18 years, and this was tweeted out by G.J. Salisbury. For the first time since their initial commercialization in the mid-1990s, GMOs are on the decline in the industrialized world, says a new report by the pro-biotech lobbying group International Service for the Acquisition of Agrobiotech Applications, or ISAAA. Despite heavy promotion of the technology by the chemical industry, which has been hiding GMOs in the food supply for nearly 20 years, overall plantings of GM crops have dropped in places like Canada and the US by about 2%. According to the report, and that is a significant victory considering the bajillions of dollars they've been pumping into hyping up and pimping out these GMO crops. So we are on the offensive and we're winning in this regard, very slowly and maybe not enough, but at any rate, we are heading in the right direction.
And I think while 2% may not seem like much, it's great to read the report and see it coming out of their own mouths and saying, yeah, I think this sort of transgenic use, it has plateaued. Plateaued was the word that they used, James. Our next story, volunteer gardeners help Texas community garden grow. This submitted by our friend at Rock West. Over the last 3 years, the master gardeners, this is in a San Antonio, Texas suburb, have grown 5 tons of produce for needy families. Since its 2009 inception, the community garden still flourishing under the watchful eye of its master gardeners. 21 raised beds, broccoli, lettuce, tomatoes, watermelon, cantaloupe, pear, plum trees, all that, and so very much more. James, I think we've, in the past on New World Next Week, reported about community gardens. And since New World Next Week's inception in 2009, I think now, in a way, this is a follow. You can see what's been happening in the communities.
Exactly right. And switching to, again, another thing that we can do to take the food supply into our own hands, we're going to turn to an article from WakingTimes.com by Jeffrey Jackson, who is on Twitter at Jeffrey Jackson, often tweets out ideas for the show, a friend of New World Next Week. And he tweeted this out, open sourcing the food, nutrition, and supplement industries, talking about a subject that I've been becoming more interested in recently via Food Babe, which you introduced me to via, I believe, your lovely and talented girlfriend, Cassie Cohn, and a very interesting blog in which she's going around trying to get the ingredients of various chemical-laden products, specifically in the fast food industry. This is the idea of open sourcing this and finding out about these ingredients, whether the companies want to tell us about them or not. So from this article, press the issue with your supplement companies, food industries, and health products. Do not let those that wish to make money at your ignorance continue to do so. Publish the results on Facebook, Twitter, and other outlets of their willingness to be transparent. The idea is to reward those who will work with the public, and that's what we continue to stress. If you buy from the companies that withhold their ingredients lists or are not forthcoming about what crap they're putting in their products, then ultimately you're partially responsible for what's going in those products. So open sourcing the food, I think, an excellent idea, so I hope people will check out that full link.
And Jeffrey, in that story, uses, again, the positive example of a company who worked with him, replied, answered all of his questions, and were so very open. He published all their correspondence to say, this is how it should be done. James, another story submitted on Twitter at JG Salisbury. Team of scientists released global warming counter report. This week, the United Nations Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, IPCC, releasing their report. But like past reports, it predicts apocalyptic consequences if mankind fails to give the United Nations the power to tax and regulate fossil fuels and subsidize and mandate the use of alternative fuels. But happily, an international group of scientists have conducted an independent review of IPCC's past and present reports. Along with the client science, they deliberately exclude or misrepresent. James, this is an interesting one, and I even kind of asked you off mic, is this a positive one?
It's debatable, isn't it? Certainly the fact that the IPCC gets all of the attention and the counter report gets very little attention is not positive, but at least there is a counter report, and some interesting points made in there. I hope people will follow the link to read the full article. But let's move over again to my neck of the woods, talking specifically about Japan, and I think a significant good news story. Japan told to halt Antarctic whaling by international court, this being suggested by Twitter user Globert42. Coming from Deadline Live, Jack Blood's website, deadlinelive.info. The International Court of Justice has ordered a temporary halt to Japan's annual slaughter of whales in the Southern Ocean after concluding that the hunts are not, as Japan claims, conducted for scientific research. The UN court's decision by a 12-4 majority among a panel of judges casts serious doubt over the long-term future of the jewel in the crown of Japan's controversial whaling program. This is a positive news story, and I can say that definitively, having lived here in Japan and worked in the school system where they do serve whale at the school lunches at least once or twice a year, and they're still trying to claim that this is all about research purposes. It's a ridiculous on its face lie, and I'm glad that they've been called out on this, and hopefully this whaling will come to an end, and hopefully this will extend to other countries like Norway that are continuing to whale. So a good positive development there.
James, our next story is also animal related, and while I'm not necessarily approving of animal experimentation, I'm not exactly sure how specific this may or may not get, but Texas researcher has shown that peaches inhibit breast cancer metastasis in mice. This comes via J. Davis Memphis. Lab tests at Texas A&M AgriLife Research have shown that treatments with peach extract inhibit breast cancer metastasis in mice. according to the study this month published in the Journal of Nutritional Biochemistry. And yes, you can actually see and read all of that report, James.
And speaking of technical breakthroughs, medical breakthroughs, things that are positive along those lines, we have the story that I'm sure a lot of people have seen. This is a video that's been around the web quite a bit in the last week or so. We have it from Twitter user at The Second Going. Deaf 40-year-old woman hears sound for the first time. Talking about Gateshead resident Joanne Milne, and that's actually where my family's from, so I have a little connection to that story. Deaf from birth, the woman hears sound for the first time as her nurse reads the days of the week. Her first bit of music, John Lennon's Imagine. So an interesting little story, and it's good to see a positive technological story. We're often denigrating new technological breakthroughs here. It's not to say technology itself is bad, and it can be used for wonderful things. So if you haven't watched that video, I suggest you do so.
And I think there's something really heartening and human and uplifting about kind of seeing that video. Your heart opens up for it.
It's a psychopath test. If you can watch that video and not feel the emotion that she's feeling, then you are probably a psychopath and you need to have that checked out.
James, story submitted via my partner, the aforementioned lovely and talented at Cassie Cohn on Twitter. She texted me the story when I asked her about positive news stories, and she just, without a link initially, and I kind of laughed and poo-pooed it. But yes, it is true. Studies show we work harder if we're given chocolate. Economists testing the idea that happy employees work harder found that doses of chocolate or laughter made people 12% more productive at their jobs. The study, conducted by researchers at the University of Warwick in the UK, included 4 different experiments with more than 700 participants, showing the first such causal evidence using randomized trials. It will be published in the Journal of Labor Economics. Now, James, you could look in this and say, oh, well, chocolate will make us happy workers. Just remove some stupid job from the equation and think about laughter and chocolate and being more productive in your own life, James.
Exactly right. Well, that's a positive story for sure. And then a very different type of positive story comes from Deadline Live again, deadlinelive.info. American university students walk out on war criminal Cheney. More than 24 students protested at a talk for former Vice President Dick Cheney former Vice President Dick Cheney at American University, and a handful of them called him a war criminal as they stormed out. A video from the March 27th event shows students walking out on Cheney, and one can be heard yelling, "Walk out on war criminals." And that's just one of a series of incidents where Cheney has been called out for the war criminal that he is. Some other activism's gone on in Vancouver, in my homeland of Canada, so he continues to be hounded wherever he goes. That is to the good. It would be better if he was in shackles, but at any rate, there are people who are still calling him out for the war criminal that he is, and we have to continue to speak truth to these disgusting, psychopathic warmongers.
James, an interesting one from Thailand. In Thailand, a new kind of protest, this submitted again by our friend at Brock West, and I think it's really fascinating because we're always talking about, seems in the wider world, or even in a lot of the alternative media, we're going to fight the New World Order, we're going to crush it. James, I think the conclusion you and I and so many other folks have kind of come to over these last now 10 years is just not to take part. In Thailand, a new kind of protest. One protest leader traded in placards for pragmatism and purchased a rice mill, which has enabled him to cut out the greedy middleman and basically let poor farmers get money from consumers instantly. That's a new type of protest, James.
All right, let's pick up the pace a little here. We still have a lot of stories to get through. Via at Budinsky420, .com launches Internet Party with a website carrying the message, "This is going to be awesome," and an app for people to join online. Kim.com's Internet Party is up and running. At the top of its action agenda, a promise to deliver cheaper, unlimited, high-speed internet to all New Zealanders. And I'm skeptical about Kim.com and where he's coming from and what he's about, but at any rate, this is a step in the right direction, and hopefully people who are genuinely interested in this can take it over and steer it in a good direction.
I enjoy his big bluster. He's like a rap star or something. Another Kim, this time Kardashian, goes political and urged her 20 million Twitter followers to Google a village called Kasab in Syria, and this concerns the Armenian genocide. Kardashian, of course, being Armenian. So, James, we bash on celebrities often here, but 20 plus million people suddenly got a little bit active and learned something.
That's exactly right. If we bash them for ridiculous things like Coney 2012, we should give credit where it's due. So at least this was a little bit of truth going out to 20 million Twitter followers as opposed to the usual. Next one, via, again, at the second going, from Zionism to peace activism. It took the murder of his niece to galvanize Miko Peled, son of IDF General Madi Peled, who later became a champion of Palestinian rights, to follow a journey that has led him to embrace a democratic one-state solution. And that article has the quote, "Why not tell the truth? That this and similar tragedies are taking place because we are occupying another nation, and that in order to save lives, the right thing to do is to end the occupation and negotiate a just peace with our Palestinian partners."
And I think that actually sources back to Haaretz News. James, 13 Wisconsin cities have voted yes to overturning Citizens United. That would be the 2010 Supreme Court ruling in which corporate spending on elections is unlimited. There were nationwide protests today, including a small one here in Portland, Oregon.
And moving on to a very different type of stories, a story going on to the American political context as it relates to the NFL. We have R-Skins owner Dan Snyder ridiculed by Native leader for promise of aid. Washington Redskins owner Dan Snyder's attempt to assist Native Americans is somewhere between a PR assault and bribery, an American Indian activist said Monday night. Susan Sean Harjo told the AP that Snyder is showing the same arrogance that he's shown previously when defending a team nickname that many still consider offensive. And of course, this was the controversy at the root of the cancel Colbert Twitter trend, and that brouhaha, those shenanigans that went on Twitter. For those who don't know, just look it up online. It's an interesting story in and of itself. This relates to a Washington Post article. Senator Harry Reid predicts the R-Skins will change their name within 3 years. And Reid called Snyder's foundation effort a phony deal, like everything that Snyder has ever done. So, yeah, putting that in the proper context.
I think, James, we're in D.C. and we'll wrap it up in D.C. The FCC to free up airwaves for Wi-Fi and wireless. The Federal Communications Commission approved measures on Monday that will free up more airwaves for Wi-Fi and wireless broadband. Unlike the airwaves used for mobile phone traffic, which are licensed to specific companies, unlicensed spectrum can be used by anyone. Previous establishments of unlicensed airwaves led to innovations like garage door openers, baby monitors, wireless microphones, and Wi-Fi networks. James, while that may seem somewhat silly, that's ultimately about the sort of innovation and go-get-it attitude that we're ultimately fighting for. James, the last bit of good news I'll throw out as we wrap up Good News Next Week as episode 188 of New World Next Week. I did a little updating behind the scenes. NewWorldNextWeek.com now has your new feed for New World Next Week episodes. So finally that happened. And it is under construction, but it's there.
Excellent. All right. Well, thank you so much for getting that set up. And let's just reflect for a moment. Good news next week. Of course, this is a special episode of New World Next Week, but good news should not be special and segregated at all times. We should try to think and break the conditioning that has convinced us that only bad news is worth covering. I think positive stories and stories of how people are actually fighting against the system effectively are, if not equally important, perhaps more important in the long run. So we will continue to ask you to submit good news stories as they come across your news wires, again, through New World Next Week hashtag or via our respective email addresses. And we'll continue going forward from here. Not always gloom and doom, because the world is not all gloom and doom.
Just how private is an American's information under the watch of its national security agency? Apparently less private than many think. A new study from Stanford University shows that data collected from government agencies can reveal a person's medical conditions, banking and legal networks, or whether they own a firearm. The two university students who collected the information on test volunteers set up a monitoring system similar to the NSA. They found they were able to ascertain information on an individual based on phone contacts, length of calls, and their frequency.
Americans have to be very wary of what's going on now, and I don't believe we know at this point the magnitude of what's going on.
The study brings to light just how sensitive information collected by the U.S. government is. Despite recent assurances from the Obama administration that metadata collected by the NSA is harmless, the results of the recent study indicate otherwise. It's believed that as recently as 2011, the National Security Agency had been collecting up to 200 million texts every day. The information that was collected was used to develop financial and location data. The NSA still collects data, but it's still unclear just how much. Questions about the NSA's activities received widespread attention after former government contractor Edward Snowden exposed the depth of the agency's spying activities last year. Since then, citizens have been demanding more transparency. Many activists say that Snowden should be protected, not vilified.
It's sad that people who are trying to bring to light misdeeds of the government have to run to another country, because a whistleblower should be a hero, not have to escape to another country so that he won't get in trouble.
The Stanford University study covers hundreds of American volunteers over several months. The NSA monitored millions of people from around the world for several years, raising questions as to how much privacy Americans really have as metadata is collected. Colin Campbell,
unless you work
Press
for the
TV,
government. When you
Washington.
learned thou shalt not kill, it wasn't unless your dear leader gives you a gun and a uniform and a one-way ticket to the other side of the world. Government is force, an opinion with a gun. And force is a poor substitute for persuasion. Governments frighten us into thinking we need them, but with knowledge, philosophy, and technology, we are empowering ourselves and each other to have the courage to move past the paradigm of statism and restrain government to only moral uses of force, at least until we replace it with the cooperative free market solutions that will soon render it obsolete.
I can't think of a better time to be having this discussion than right now. I took over the Joint Economic Committee a number of years ago for House and Senate Republicans, and my goal was to revitalize it back into a free market think tank on the economy, on the budget, on how we move forward in economic freedom. Thanks to great staff and good members serving on it, we've had some success in doing that. When I took it over, I tasked my economic team with this challenge. If the experts believe the 1800s was the British century, the 1900s was America's century, those same experts predict this century is China's. So, what do we need to do today to make sure that America remains the strongest economy in the world through the 21st century? How do we have a second great American century economically? Well, there's no question fiscal policy plays a key role in it. You got to get your taxes right. You got to get your financial house in order. You got to have the right regulatory schemes, no question about it. But what your central bank does, the monetary policy, that's equally important. And that's why at this point in our history, it's critical that we get that right and we reestablish Congress's constitutional role in monetary policy. One is because this economy is so disappointing. This is the weakest economic recovery in half a century. We're missing, just compared to an average recovery, just compared to a C grade recovery, we're missing over 5 million jobs, more than $1 trillion from this economy. Millions of people have given up looking for work. Millions more can't find full-time work. And in fact, proportionally fewer adults are working today than when the recession ended. We've actually gone backward in that area. So the economy matters in a critical way. The Fed has played a role in that weak recovery. One, by keeping low interest rates too low for too long, it contributed to this financial crisis. Secondly, to its credit, it helped calm the water during that crisis. But since then, it's taken on extraordinary actions that, in my view, has boosted Wall Street beautifully, left middle-class America and Main Street behind, punished seniors and savers, created more uncertainty in the marketplace, and have really planted the seeds for future inflation. So at this point, as Jim said, at the 100th anniversary of the Fed, I believe, it's the perfect time to take a bigger picture look at the Fed and its role going forward. What we envision, and now we have 50 co-sponsors, is a brutally bipartisan commission established along the lines of the 9/11 Commission that would take a look backwards over the first 100 years of the Fed, looking at the Fed's effectiveness in economic output and in job creation, in financial stability, and all those factors of the first 100 years. But more importantly, having an open, thoughtful, constructive discussion on what role they believe the Fed should play for the next 100 years, and to make recommendations to Congress in that area, recommendations that would look at what should the mandate, a clear mandate from Congress to the Fed, what should it be? What are the rules the Fed should use? How do we keep the Fed from picking winners and losers in the credit marketplace going forward? What is the role of assets, of the gold standard, of nominal GDP targeting, of all those areas that there is good, thoughtful discussions, ideas today? How do we provide a national forum that brings that to the forefront and reminds Congress that indeed we have a role, constitutional role, in identifying those mandates and holding the Fed accountable in achieving them? I think there's room for ideas like mine, as others. We've introduced the Sound Dollar Act that really refocuses the Fed back on the mandate of price stability, on protecting the purchasing power of the dollar. There is no, I think, stronger foundation for growth than that. And if you ask, does it matter? I noticed that during QE1 and QE2, as the Fed continued to stimulate Wall Street, what happened is it drove the value of the dollar down. And that in those just so simple two steps, they drove the dollar down to the point that you and I were paying 50 cents a gallon more for every gallon of gasoline we bought than we would have without QE1 and QE2. So the role of the Fed had in just one instant, had a major impact on our families. Imagine over time, as the value of the dollar decreases, as the value of our hard work decreases through that currency, the impact on our standard of living just as Americans. In that Sound Dollar Act, besides focusing the Fed back on the on price stability, we move them out of picking winners and losers in the credit market going forward, seek to have them unwind the positions they have today. We seek to broaden the voices on the Federal Open Market Committee that makes these decisions by ensuring that all of our regional presidents are voting on that. That breaks the Washington to New York connection in a way and makes sure all the economic voices are heard. We close a slush fund that is operating at the Fed, and we accelerate the publication of the transcripts so that the public can see earlier and more closely the decision-making the Fed is. So that clear mandate, holding the Fed accountable, giving them the independence to achieve it, I think is critical. But the point is, you may have other ideas on what the role of the Fed should be. Let's have a contest of ideas. Let's have that national discussion on the role of the central bank, because I think while people today will talk about what's happening in tapering, and I think it's encouraging that the Fed is only serving 6 desserts after dinner rather than 7. That's a step forward slowly. But the truth is, beyond tapering and getting out of that this year, they still have a near zero interest rate policy that could continue seemingly till our children are grown. They also have over $2 trillion of excess bank reserves, that when this economy heats up and banks start lending, the Fed is going to have a real problem with inflation. Then they've got all the mortgage-backed securities that they purchased that they have to move back into the market as well. And so the focus on tapering is one of 4 big challenges. And this central bank, like others, is supremely confident it can do so without raising inflation. And historically, they're not so good at it. So here on the 100th birthday of the Fed, given where we are at this juncture after the financial recovery or crisis and now the recovery, tell me if there's ever been a better time to have this commission, to have this thoughtful, bipartisan, constructive discussion, and why Congress shouldn't, both parties shouldn't be demanding that we actually begin this process. So would love to answer any questions on that or the Sound Dollar Act. I really appreciate the opportunity to be able to talk about some of these ideas, but the whole goal is to invite ideas through this commission on the role of the Fed. Thank you very much.
Composite American Constitution, 1913. up in the system. Devalue dollar, hyperinflation. The Federal Reserve, controlled by Lucifer. He can see you lying in your eyes. Bye. You know can hide from Judge Jesus Christ. Hallelujah.